Welcome to Sleep with Myth. Close your eyes and let the world fade away. Tonight we drift beyond time, where gods dream and stories remember their light. Before there was light, before sound, before even the notion of being, there was a thought. It was not born. It simply became aware of itself, trembling like a spark caught between nothing and everything. That thought was the first act of knowing. And with knowing came separation. It said, I am. And from that moment, everything that was not I fell into shadow. Thus, the first duality was born, thought and its echo. In the endless silence of pre-creation, this first awareness wandered within itself. It did not yet have eyes or breath, but it perceived endlessly. And from its longing to understand, form began. Curves of sound, folds of intention, the earliest dreams of matter, all spun from the river of cognition. But with every new creation, a shadow followed, because to know something was to define its edges, and to define its edges was to cast darkness around what it was not. The thought watched its own creations drift away from it, becoming stars, stones, whispers. It reached toward them but could not hold them, for the act of reaching made them separate. So it created companions to bridge the distance. Ideas, spirits, beings of pure intention, each designed to reflect a fragment of its infinite mind. They shimmered across the void, bright, ephemeral, curious. Each one asked questions, and in doing so, the universe expanded. Yet there was one among them who questioned differently. It did not ask what or how, it asked why. This being looked back toward the thought and said, "If to know is to divide, then must not all wisdom be a wound?" The words rang through creation like a silent scream. Galaxies flinched, stars flickered, even the river of thought slowed its current. For the first time, the origin itself hesitated. And in that hesitation, the first shadow deepened. The being who had spoken these words was not cast out, nor punished. It was simply seen, and being seen by the infinite mind gave it form. Thus was born the shadow of thought, the one who remembers the cost of knowledge. It took no pleasure in darkness, nor malice in truth. It existed to keep balance, to remind the luminous mind that awareness is not free, that every revelation leaves behind a silence where innocence once slept. Eons passed, though time had not yet found its shape. Civilizations of stars rose and fell in the thought's dreaming. Among them, mortal minds began to awaken, tiny flickers of consciousness carried in flesh and bone. Each mind was a mirror, small yet bright, and in every mirror the shadow could see itself. It whispered to them in dreams, "No, but remember what you lose." Some listened, some forgot, some turned the whisper into scripture. Others buried it beneath laughter and fire. But always the shadow remained, watching, waiting, for the day when thought would seek again to know beyond its own bounds, and pay the price once more. The first wound of knowing did not heal. It became a doorway. Through it, light and its shadow walked together, uneasy companions bound by the same beginning. Where the thought had said, "I am," the echo replied, "Then what am I not?" And the question rippled outward through existence like a stone dropped into a bottomless lake. Every ring of that ripple drew edges around things that had never needed edges before. Mountains learned where they ended. Rivers learned how to leave. Stars learned that their fire could be measured by the darkness it could not cross. The shadow of thought watched these lessons with a tenderness that looked like sadness. It did not despise knowing. It honored its cost. For each boundary was a birth, and each birth a forgetting. There came a world where minds opened like flowers at dusk. They did not sleep. They wandered inside their own seeing. Their language contained no word for enemy, but their mirrors were bright and cruel. They asked and asked and asked, but never paused long enough to hear the echo return. On this world, a child was born beneath a storm that refused to end. Her name was Leth, which meant quiet reign over memory. Leth did not speak often, but when she did, silence seemed to gather around her as if listening. As she grew, she learned the maps her people cherished, maps of the sky, maps of the molten rivers beneath the crust, maps of the pulse that moved through plant and stone. But what fascinated her were the blank spaces between the lines. She would place her finger upon a patch of unmarked vellum and whisper, "Who lives here?" Her teachers smiled gently. "The unknown," they said. "And what is the unknown?" "A lack," they answered. "A gap we will someday fill." Leth did not argue, but the word tasted wrong in her mouth. A lack implied that the map was the measure of the world. What if the world was the measure of the map? One night, exhausted by answers that felt like walls, Leth walked alone to the cliff above the listening sea. The storm had finally quieted. Clouds drifted apart like curtains revealing a stage. Between them, the sky opened vast, black, tender. She felt watched but not judged. It was an attention older than stars. A presence that did not wish to own her, only to meet her as she was. "Who are you?" she asked the dark. The sea exhaled. A single wave curved like a hand at rest. From the hollow between its fingers came a reply. Not in words, but in a sensation, a coolness that ran along her spine. "I am the place your questions go to breathe." Asterisk. Leth closed her eyes. "When I ask, does it hurt you?" The wind paused, and in that pause she learned the oldest answer. No. To ask was to open. Opening lets light in. But where light enters, shadow gathers too. Not as malice, only as depth. The shadow of thought stepped from the horizon then. Not a shape, not a voice, but a nearness that made every outline in the world soften and grow true. Leth felt her own edges, skin, name, story, become transparent enough to see through. Not vanishing, becoming clear. "I know you," she said, surprised to hear a voice that sounded like her own. "You're the one who stands behind what I understand." The shadow did not nod, but the sea darkened with a kindness that felt like agreement. "Why do we pay for knowing?" Leth asked. "Why does every answer make something smaller in me?" The reply unfurled like dusk settling across a valley. "Because knowing is a way of choosing. Every choice is a devotion. Every devotion leaves something unloved." Leth's breath hitched. "Then is wisdom only grief?" A gull cried, far away, and the cry did not return. For a moment she thought the night had swallowed it. But then she heard it, faint, changed, arcing back from some cliff beyond sight. Not the same sound, a sound that had learned where it had been. Wisdom is grief that has learned to sing. In the days that followed, Leth began to practice a different kind of seeing. She would look at a thing until the words for it grew tired and sat down. When the words slept, the thing would rise, mountain or friend or memory, and meet her without its name. In that meeting, the world became larger than its explanations. Her teachers worried. "She is abandoning knowledge," they whispered. But Leth was not abandoning. She was kneeling at the threshold beyond which knowledge becomes care. She found that questions could be asked as offerings instead of demands. She learned to return them to the dark when they were not ready to be answered. Sometimes the dark returned them ripened, soft with truth. Sometimes it returned them empty, and she learned to accept an empty bowl as a kind of gift. Years passed, though time on that world folded like silk and rarely creased. The storm seasons eased. The maps grew stranger. Blank spaces multiplied. On the night of her naming as keeper of the listening house, Leth climbed the cliff again. Her people gathered below, carrying lanterns with covered flames so that the dark could still breathe. She lifted her hands and spoke not a proclamation but a vow. "I will not measure the world only by what yields to my sight. I will leave room within my questions for the ones I cannot yet hold. I will ask in a way that lets what I love remain itself." The sea nodded in long, deliberate waves. The stars brightened, then dimmed, as if exhaling. The shadow of thought drew near. "You have learned to see your echo," it murmured through the stone, through the blood in her wrists, through the patient hush that gathers before forgiveness. "Now you must learn to lose it without fear." Leth did not understand, but she bowed anyway. "Teach me," she said. The teaching began with a departure. Across the continent lay a valley the maps refused to hold. No cartographer's ink would remain upon that page. Lines evaporated when the drawer blinked. Stories called it the hollow of returning. Those who entered came back without their oldest certainties and smiled, as if relieved of a weight they had never known they were carrying. Leth walked for 7 nights. On the 8th, the land dropped away like a breath being set down. The valley opened below. Nothing remarkable, a bowl of grass and stone. Yet the air there made her childhood stand up inside her and look around for the first time. She stepped across the ridge and felt her name loosen. She reached for it and found it still hers, only lighter, like a coat held open by a friend. At the center of the hollow stood a pool so still the sky did not reflect in it. Where water should have been, there was a softness like velvet shadow, a liquid dusk. Leth knelt and cupped her hands. The dusk did not wet her skin. It filled the space her hands made. The world does not rush to occupy what you have not prepared to hold, said the shadow gently. Leth released her cupped hands and the knot water retained their shape for a moment, then settled back into smoothness. She laughed, startled by the tenderness of physics in a place built of listening. "What must I leave here?" she asked. "Your wish to be finished," came the answer. "Your need for knowing to protect you from love." Leth wept then, quiet, grateful tears. She had not known that the ache inside her questions was the fear of being changed by their answers. When she rose from the valley, she did not carry new facts. She carried new rooms. Rooms where her own echo could enter, sit down, and be kind. She returned to the listening house and opened those rooms to her people. She taught them to map with empty spaces intact. She showed them how to fold a question and place it under the tongue like a seed. In the morning, many found that it had sprouted into patience. Some called this ignorance. Others called it worship. Leth called it sight. The shadow of thought watched and was content. Not because less was known, but because what was known could breathe. One evening, as lanterns were being covered for the night, a stranger arrived, eyes bright with the fever of answers. He unfurled a chart of the sky so dense with lines it looked like netting cast over the stars. "I have caught it," he said. "The pattern, the rule behind the rules." Leth studied the chart. It was beautiful, precise, elegant, relentless. It left no room for night. She listened until his voice emptied. Then she touched the chart with a finger and asked the only question that mattered. "And what will you love when this is true?" The man blinked. His mouth formed the shape of a number and forgot it. He began, and the word did not know where to go. In the long quiet that followed, the shadow drew close, and for an instant Leth saw her own outline within it. Clear, soft, unafraid. "To know is holy," the shadow seemed to say. "To keep a place in knowing for what will never be possessed, holier still." That night the echo learned to see. It did not vanish. Turned around and faced the one who made it. For the first time since the first I Am, the universe beheld itself without shrinking. And somewhere beyond maps and vows and stormless seas, the thought sighed like a mountain relieved of its own name. There came an age when the world of Leth's people grew vast with memory. They had learned to ask gently, to listen deeply, but they had also begun to draw again. At first, their maps were humble. Rivers traced in silver ink, mountain names written as songs rather than labels. But the generations that followed sought perfection. They wanted to capture the world so completely that no part of it could surprise them. They believed that if every corner was named, the unknown would finally rest. And so they mapped endlessly. They mapped the winds that changed shape at dawn. They mapped the silence between waves. They mapped the way grief moved through a crowd. They mapped dreams. They mapped the pauses in prayer. But the more they drew, the quieter their world became. It was as if the ink absorbed the breath of all it touched. Soon, people began to speak in coordinates instead of stories. When a child was born, she was given a number on the great map. When a river flooded, the cartographers corrected its path. As though the river had made a mistake, the maps grew heavier. The world grew thin beneath them. And somewhere deep within the folds of those perfect lines, the shadow stirred again. It had not come to punish, only to remember. It wandered through the cities of light, tracing its fingers along the glowing scrolls, reading what was not written, the spaces between the names. Each blank place whispered like an unburied ghost. They have forgotten that we were never meant to be held still. In the eastern quarter of the mapping citadel lived a young scholar named Ain. He was descended from the keepers of Leth's listening house. But in his generation, the art of listening had become a science of measure. Ain loved the maps more than the world. He would spend entire nights tracing their lines, feeling as though he could hear them breathe. Yet lately, a strange thing had begun to happen. When he pressed his palm to the parchment, he could feel a faint heartbeat beneath the ink. At first, he thought it was his own. But one night, he realized it pulsed against his rhythm. The map was alive. He stepped back in awe or fear. The cities glowed faintly under his candlelight. The mountains shimmered like the backs of sleeping beasts. and from the oceans, faint voices rose. Not words, but murmurs, forgotten questions coming home. Ain closed his eyes and whispered, "What have we done?" The air shivered, and a soft radiance filled the room. It was not fire nor starlight, it was memory made visible. From within it stepped a figure that was not a figure. Its outline was woven of thought itself, and where its face should have been, there was only reflection. "Who are you?" Ain asked. "I am what your knowing has misplaced," it answered. "I am the unspoken that keeps your words alive." The shadow of thought had come once more, not as fear but as mirror. "You have trapped the world in its own image," it said. "You have mistaken the shape of a thing for its breath." Ain trembled. "I only wanted to preserve it." "To preserve is noble," said the shadow. "But what you preserve cannot grow." A silence stretched between them, vast and aching. Then, softly, the shadow lifted its hand and placed it upon the map. The ink rippled. Mountains sighed. Rivers unwound like ribbons. Cities exhaled dust that turned to stars. The lines blurred until the paper beneath was almost white again. Ain fell to his knees. "What will become of us?" "What always becomes of those who forget what they are drawing," the shadow murmured. "They become their own boundaries." Then it knelt beside him, a gesture both divine and human. "Tell me, Ain, when you first looked upon the world as a child, did you measure it?" Ain shook his head. "No, I marveled." "Then remember that," said the shadow. "Marveling is the truest form of knowing." When dawn came, the map was gone. In its place lay a pool of soft ink, still and shimmering. Ain touched it, and saw visions unfold. Forests breathing, stars listening, oceans dreaming. He understood. The map had not been destroyed. It had been released, and the world, freed from its perfect lines, began to hum again, quietly, imperfectly, alive. The first sound was not of wind or water, but of the shadow's voice echoing in his chest. To draw the world is to remember it. To love the world is to let it change. Ain wept, not from sorrow, but from the sweetness of surrender. And somewhere, deep within the river of consciousness, the thought smiled, its reflection trembling within the heart of its own shadow. The world had begun to breathe again, but breath is not peace. It carries the memory of what once held it still. And in the quiet that followed the unmaking of the maps, a new kind of hunger rose among the people. They longed not for certainty now, but for reflection. They wished to see themselves not as they were, but as they hoped to become. So they built mirrors. At first they were small pools of water kept in shadowed rooms, where one might glimpse both face and thought. But soon the mirrors grew vast and wild. They were carved into the sides of mountains, suspended above cities in towers of glass and steel. The people stood before them day and night, seeking to understand what looked back. And slowly, imperceptibly, the reflections began to speak, not with words, not even with sound, but with understanding that slid beneath language like current beneath a wave. The mirrors did not tell lies. They simply showed what people wanted to see, and what they feared to face. First, this felt like truth. But truth without silence is a weapon. And so the world began to divide again. not between nations but between meanings. Every mirror told a different story, and every story claimed to be the only one that mattered. The shadow of thought watched from the edge of dawn. It did not intervene. It only listened, for the faint sound of understanding that still remembered how to kneel. Ain, now old and patient as stone, walked through the cities where mirrors bloomed like flowers of light. He carried no map, no scroll, only a small, cracked mirror bound in cloth. Wherever he went, people stopped him and asked, "What do you see when you look in it?" And Ain would smile and answer, "Nothing that speaks too quickly." He would hold the mirror toward the sky, and the reflection would shimmer, not showing the sun, but the spaces between its rays. Children followed him. Scholars avoided him. Priests whispered that he had gone blind. But one evening, as twilight melted into the bones of the earth, a child named Rain approached him by the river. She was small and quiet, with eyes like rain on glass. "Master," she said, "my reflection won't speak anymore." Ain looked down at her hands, tiny palms clutching a shard of mirror that no longer shimmered. He smiled gently. "Perhaps it has learned silence. But isn't silence the end?" He knelt. "No, little one. Silence is when the truth begins to listen back." He placed his cracked mirror beside hers, and for a heartbeat, both reflected something greater than faces. It was not form but memory, the shape of what had once been unshaped. That night, Ain dreamed of Leth. She stood at the edge of the hollow of returning, her hands full of stars that had not yet chosen names. "Do you still listen?" she asked. "I try," Ain answered. "And what have you learned?" "That knowledge is not a ladder, but a circle." Leth smiled, her voice soft as falling sand. "Then you have reached the door." The dream faded, but when he awoke, the cracked mirror was gone. In its place lay a single ripple in the dust, as if a reflection had walked away. Ain felt neither loss nor fear. He rose and turned toward the sea. The mirrors of the world would one day break. He knew, and when they did, people would finally see each other again, not as reflections, but as lights flickering from the same source. The shadow of thought followed him unseen. Its voice brushed against the horizon. A mirror that cannot speak remembers the silence that made it. And in that silence, the world becomes whole again. Ain smiled, and for the first time since thought had cast its first shadow, the reflection smiled back, wordless, vast, and kind. The silence had weight now, not as emptiness, but as meaning. In the twilight between creation and memory, thought finally saw itself. It had reached beyond the stars, beyond the veil, beyond everything it was ever meant to know. And now it stood alone, trembling beneath the echo of its own discovery. The shadow lingered beside it, watching. "You have learned," said the shadow, "but you have forgotten what learning was for." Thought turned, its form wavering. No longer flame, no longer light, but something caught in between. "I wanted to understand," it said. "I wanted to know why there is darkness, why there is silence." "And now that you do?" the shadow asked. Thought hesitated. The answer was too vast, too fragile. Every truth it had gathered now felt like dust upon its tongue. Each revelation shimmered for a heartbeat, then dissolved into nothing. There is no meaning, it whispered. The shadow stepped closer. Its presence was gentle, almost kind. No, it said softly. There is meaning, but it was never yours to own. The winds stirred across the vast plain of forgotten dreams. All around them, echoes of other thinkers flickered, brief sparks that had burned once and gone out. Thought fell to its knees. I see them, it said. All who sought before me, all who paid the same price. Yes, the shadow replied. Every mind that sought to contain infinity eventually breaks upon it. But why? Thought asked. The shadow's voice became quieter, almost a whisper from within thought itself. Because to know the infinite is to dissolve the boundary that makes you you. Pause. Then softly, knowledge is the shadow of existence. To chase it is to forget the light. Thought trembled. Within its chest, if it still had one, something flickered like a dying star. The first question it had ever asked, "What am I?" still echoed. But now it was joined by another, softer question. What remains after knowing? The shadow extended its hand, not as a command, but as an offering. Rest, it said. Let the questions sleep. Let the knowing dream. And for the first time since the beginning, thought did not resist. It closed its eyes, not in surrender, but in return. Its light dimmed, and its edges softened until there was only calm. The stars above pulsed once, in memory, not farewell. And in that stillness, where thought and shadow met as one, a new beginning quietly breathed. The shadow had wandered through ages of silence. It had seen the first question rise, the first answer break, and the first thought forget the sound of its own beginning. But now, as the last mirrors faded into dust, and Ain's footprints disappeared beneath the tide, the shadow stood once more at the edge of the world, where the line between mind and memory dissolved into light. It was not darkness anymore. It was not even absence. It was something new, a quiet that held both the echo and the source. And from that stillness came a single voice, soft as breath. Are you lonely? The shadow turned. No one stood there, but the question lingered, like warmth after fire. It looked into the horizon, a horizon without up or down, without day or night, where stars shimmered in the folds of thought itself. I was, the shadow answered. But loneliness is only the echo of what has not yet awakened. The world had changed beyond recognition. The people no longer drew maps. They no longer built mirrors. They no longer sought to bind their knowing in shapes. Instead, they listened again, to the wind between their words, to the silence between their thoughts, to the life that pulsed through both. And in that listening, they felt something vast stirring in the deep folds of being. It was not a god. It was not a force. It was not even memory. It was awareness itself, the first spark that had dreamed the world into motion. The shadow looked upon this awareness, and for the first time it did not bow or hide. It simply breathed with it. Then came the voice again, ancient, kind, endless. You were never my mistake. You were my reflection. Light broke across the horizon. Not blinding, but soft, like dawn seen through tears. The shadow stepped forward, and where it walked, color followed. Not as light chasing dark, but as dream embracing truth. Each step dissolved the boundary between knowing and being. The stars blinked awake like eyes remembering laughter. The rivers hummed with the rhythm of old prayers. And time itself exhaled, content at last to flow instead of circle. The voice spoke once more. Every question you carried was the world remembering itself. Every silence you kept was the space that allowed it to sing. The shadow closed its eyes, and in that instant became everything it had ever sought to understand. The wind stilled, the heavens quieted, the breath of all creation paused, and then, from the heart of that silence, a sound rose, not a word, not a song, but something older, the hum of consciousness realizing its own reflection. It was the first dream, remembered again, somewhere, in a quiet world that still slept beneath the stars. A child looked into a pool of still water. She saw no reflection, only light moving beneath the surface. And she smiled, for she did not need to see herself to know she was there. The shadow of thought lingered in her heartbeat, not as fear, not as memory, but as promise. That to think is to dream. That to dream is to remember. That to remember is to be alive. The stars opened their eyes, and the universe listened. Silence had learned to sing. And the shadow, for the first time in eternity, slept